Welcome to WinDevCon 2007 WinDev Mobile Basics. In this course we're going to try to cover all the aspects of WinDev Mobile development that you need to know about before you start using the tool. The first step, of course, is to show you that, well, when you start WinDev Mobile, basically you are exactly at home. Except for the fact that you have WinDev Mobile written here and in the title. The tool by itself looks exactly the same than WinDev and WebDev. They had a working solution, they had no reason to change, which means that you will be extremely familiar with the tool, how it works, and what you can do with it. So that's the first step. Of course, there will be differences, and these differences will be the thing that will create problem for you. So we're going to look at that. So let's talk a little about the characteristic of the hardware tool you're going to need the device by itself, the mobile device. The first thing to look at is the operating system. Well, WinDev Mobile works with devices that support only some operating systems, and basically it's Windows for mobile. So you have Windows CE3, CE40, 40 for Option, 4.2. Then you have Windows Pocket PC 2002-2003, and you have Windows Mobile 2003 to 2006. That's what's available for WinDev Mobile. If you're asking your program to work on anything else, it won't work. No iPhone, no nothing that is not exactly using Windows. Then you have the processor. Not only do you need to have this version of Windows working on it, but also some specific processors. ARM processors are the biggest family. Xscale, Samsung, ARM compatible, x86, x86 compatible. As you can see, basically you will have most of the time an ARM or ARM compatible. What will happen most of the time is that you will find a device that supports the version of the operating system that you're looking for, and then you will try to find out what processor they are using, and you will find one of those. I currently didn't find a device using the operating system I was looking for and not using a compatible processor. Probably because, well, this operating system won't work on anything else, so that's the reason why. Now the device type. There are basically three big family of device, and we're going to talk about them. I never found an official definition of what makes one device be part of one family or another. Let's say that it's an accepted definition. It's most of the time the accepted definition, but it's just to give you an idea of how to organize things. So the first type of device is the smartphone. Well, it's a phone, obviously. It has a phone keyboard, you know, with these 3 or 4 letters per button, and it has some advanced function, and you can install program on them. So that's the little advanced phone that you find, and it is working under Windows. Then you have the pocket phone. The difference between the smartphone and the pocket phone is in the entry level. Now suddenly, instead of having this phone keyboard, you have a QWERTY keyboard. I currently never saw one with a keyboard in another language than English for this kind of thing, so it's generally QWERTY keyboard. But at least you don't have to type 3 times on the key to get an E or anything like that. And then you have the Pocket PC. For the Pocket PC, you replace or you add to the QWERTY keyboard a touchscreen. Some of them have both, and some of them just have the touchscreen. In my case, I chose one with a touchscreen only, because considering the size of my fingers, each time I would try to use a QWERTY keyboard, I would press in fact 2 or 3 keys each time, so that was absolutely not usable for me. So these are the three basic type of device that you will find out there when you are talking about WinDev Mobile. We already saw that the editor is very much like WinDev and WebDev. The tool looks the same, the language is the same, many functions are available the same way. So let's have a look at what is the same and what is different. First, let's look at what is more like WebDev than WinDev. Clearly, the environment is less stable. The same way that when you're on the web, you have all these external problems that add to the complexity of your system, and you have an environment that is way less stable in WinDev. Well, in WinDev Mobile, you have also an environment that is less stable. Both for the development, you have more complexity and more trouble with the development, then and also more when you are using the software afterwards, you are in a system that is clearly more complex and more difficult to have it work properly. You are moving all the time, you lose connections all the time, you are on a very small device. All these things make this development more similar to the WebDev development than WinDev. Then you have the hardware-related problems. In WebDev, you had the fact that it could work on any type of hardware with any type of browser and operating system. Well, here it's the same thing. You can have, as you can see, several different operating systems, and of course, all this is going to create problems and incompatibilities. Again, here the debug is more complex, just like in WebDev. You will have to deal with things that are just not the same. You are developing on a machine on Windows, and the program has to run after that on a very different hardware with a different operating system. So you will have problem to debug that you don't have in WinDev. Clearly also, WinDev Mobile is a much younger product than WinDev. It didn't mature with the same possibilities than WinDev. It's still a young product. They created the program first WinDev, then WebDev, then WinDev Mobile, and you feel that when you are using the product. WebDev is not as mature as WinDev, and WinDev Mobile is even less than that. Now there are a few aspects that makes the development more like WinDev than WebDev. The first thing is that most of the time when you're using a mobile device, you are doing local access. You are working on a local database on your device. That's the highest percentage of use. Of course, at some point you're going to want to connect your mobile device to your network and exchange information between the two, but it's rare that you are deploying an application on a mobile device where you rely on a connection at all time. And the reason for that is that it's extremely difficult for a mobile device to have a connection at all time. But we'll talk about that in more detail later, of course. And of course, it's more like WinDev because you don't have any HTML, JavaScript, Java related problem, all these problems that you have when you're working in WebDev. Yes, you have on this mobile a browser available, and therefore you can access the web, and you could perfectly access a website developed in WebDev. But in that case, it would be WebDev development for a mobile device, which means smaller screen and lighter website. It wouldn't be WinDev mobile development. So when you're talking WinDev mobile, you don't have this kind of problem. Now let's see what a WinDev mobile system is able to do in general. The first thing, of course, is to access data locally. A WinDev mobile program can access CE databases. CE database are basically native database to the Windows mobile operating system. It's the database that are used to store the emails, the contact information, all this kind of thing that you have typically on a PDA. So of course it's able to access this data. It's also able to manage other type of database. Hyperfile is natively available on WinDev mobile, so you can use an hyperfile database directly in your mobile. So that's an extremely powerful tool in that environment. It's also able to access data on a PC. WinDev Mobile has ODBC, OLEDB access. So as long as you have a connection to a PC, well, you can access a database that's on the PC. There's no problem there. Of course, you need a network connection of some kind, which can be Wi-Fi, by example. It can also access data on the web. All these devices have browser capabilities, so they have an access to the web. It's either via the network, if you connect to your local network via USB cable or whatever is available on your device, and you're part of the network, you can access the web. Same thing if you connect via Wi-Fi. But you have also the native system of any phone, where you have a phone system in GPRS, Edge, 3G, and so on. If you don't know what these names are, well, you better start looking for them, because you will need to deal with this kind of problem, different type of phone network and their capabilities when you develop in WinDev Mobile. WinDev Mobile program is also able to print locally on the mobile device if there is a printing hardware connected to it, of course, and in that case it will be a specific hardware. This specific hardware is generally expensive and well, it's obviously small and mobile, so you can print directly on it. You can also print on a network printer if you have access to the network once again. In that case, you're in the normal environment with the Windows drivers and so on. And so on. As you can see, basically, as soon as you connect your device to the network, you use it the same way that you would use a laptop, let's say. Now, when you have your device not connected to your local network, then you have access to more functions that are specific to the device, like, of course, the phone system that is, of course, something specific to the mobile's environment. Let's compare the classical software development with the WinDev mobile software development. The same way we did for WebDev, this will give you some element to compare and know where you're going when you start this kind of software development. Well, in classical software development, remember that the code and the UI are merged. That was the main difference between WinDev and WebDev. Well, it's going to be the same kind of problem with WinDev Mobile. So here the code and UI are merged and everything is always accessible. You are on the same machine that you are developing for. Now, in WinDev Mobile software development, when you are developing, you test first on an emulator that is available natively. It's going to display a very nice window, pretty, with the design of your PDA. It's really nice. But you're on an emulator, and the real thing is clearly going to be different. And how different is going to be the reason why you have so much trouble when you develop this kind of software. So clearly the available power and speed are not the same. You are generally coding on a machine that has currently a dual-core processor with 2 GB of RAM, I don't know how many hundreds of megabytes of hard drive, and so on. It's really something that is extremely powerful. Now you're talking about developing a software for a device that has really not the same thing. The device I'm using, which is quite a high-end device, it's currently the HTC P3300, has a ARM processor, ARM compatible processor at 200 MHz. It has natively 64 megabytes of RAM. 64 megabytes, not 2 gig. And there's no hard drive, so you have to add another SIM card in it. In mine it's a 2 GB SIM card, and this 2 GB SIM are in fact used both as the memory available for your program to work and as your hard drive. So as you can see, clearly it's not the same thing. And one example of the consequences of that is something I wrote for an Italian customer. He wanted to be able to import a text file in his database on his PDA. Why import a text file on the PDA? I have no idea, but that's what he wanted to do. So I created a small program where I was reading the text file and importing it. And in the emulator it was perfect. It was running, displaying the current record and all that. Really neat, really working fine, no problem. As soon as you put that on the device itself, and I tried it on mine, well, it's still working. But you have one record popping after the next one. And the reason for that is that, well, there's just not enough processing power. When you are writing in a SIM card, well, it's not the speed. You would think it's memory, so it's faster than a hard drive. Not so. It's memory, but it's memory that will stay there when you cut the power, which means that it's a totally different type of memory than the RAM that you have on your machine. And the access is much slower than that. So you have now access that is slower than on your hard drive, and you have to deal with that. So clearly there will be some processing that will work perfectly in the emulator and will perhaps work in a way that is not acceptable on a mobile device, and you will have to find solution for that. Of course, also the access to resources, files, printer, and so on are different. Why? Well, when you test on the emulator, again, it's emulating the fact that you're on a device, but you are in fact on the machine. So it means that the printer is there, it's connected. When you're on the mobile device, well, first, perhaps it's not connected all the time, so you have to deal with that. Then also perhaps the way to access it is going to be different. The files themselves are going to be in a different place with different syntax to access them, and so on. So all the things that you can do in the emulator are not things that you can always do on the device, and the contrary is true too. So the connection will be available or not, the network, Wi-Fi, phone, all that. Is it on? Is it available? Is it a functionality that is working on this particular device? And can you test that on the emulator? Well, obviously the emulator will not be able to connect to the phone network. So there are things that you will just not be able to test on the emulator. So all that are making for a more difficult development cycle. Then you also have the problem with the screen size. The screen is going to be small, and in fact it's going to be much smaller than in the emulator generally. What happens is that the emulator is giving you the correct number of pixels that you have in your machine. You set it up for that. So that's not the problem. The problem is that this the density of the pixel on your screen is generally much smaller, way less than on your PDA. The pixels by themselves are bigger, so you see much better on the emulator than you will see on the PDA most of the time, which means that you create your screens for the emulator and everything is perfectly readable, it's fine, it's nice, and then you put the program on the PDA and any old guy like me will need his glasses to be able to read the damn thing, and will be extremely unhappy with you about that. So it's another problem that you have to deal with. Clearly, you have to again adapt to the fact that when you develop for WinDev Mobile, with WinDev Mobile for a mobile device, it's not the same thing than in WinDev, and you have to think in a different way. Again, it's a different development philosophy. WinDev Mobile minimized the mobile development difficulties the same way that WebDev is minimizing the web development difficulties. Doesn't mean that these difficulties are not there anymore. They're just hidden by WinDev Mobile. So it tries to hide that you're developing a mobile application, and for many aspects it does, but still you have all these problems. The big difference that you have to consider is that a mobile application is working on specific devices on a very harder environment. You have to remember that at all time when you are designing your application. When you develop in WinDev, you are designing your application based on an at least scenario. What do I mean by that? Well, you will work with at least a 15-inch screen, and that's it. You will have at least 800 by 600 in definition on your screen. You will have at least Windows XP and at least a processor at that speed, and that's your bottom line, and you will it will match most of the time 95% of potential users, so that's perfectly acceptable. In WinDev Mobile, the problem is that there is no uniformity. You will not be able to use an at least scenario. Basically, again, like in WebDev, you have two cases. Either you are creating an application for one specific company or group of users that you know and you can manage, and in that case you will have some control on what will be available. That's the only time when you will have this at least scenario. Or you're creating an application for the general public, for everybody, and you have to accommodate all cases, and these cases are much more different and hard to accommodate than it is in WinDev. Let's take an example, Skype. Skype is a very big program out there. If you're not using it yet for your communication, I would strongly advise that you have a look at it. I'm using it heavily for all my communication needs, and well, there is a Skype mobile version that works on Windows Mobile the same way than your application could work on Windows Mobile. So how do they manage that? Well, when you want to download Skype for mobile, you start by choosing your brand of phone, the brand of the device that you are using. Then you are choosing which model of phone you are you are using, and then you download the corresponding version. They are not telling you, okay, you have a mobile, just download and it works. It's not possible in the mobile environment. So if a big company like Skype is going through all these steps to let you download something, there's a good reason for that. So clearly, if you want to create an application for everybody out there, at least everybody using Windows Mobile, you will need either one version that is adapted for each case, let's say the Skype example where you choose this or that, or one version that can adapt to each case, which means a version that you can set up differently for this case, that case, this type of screen, this type of screen, and so on and so forth. In the first case, well, you will have several versions to manage, which can very easily become a nightmare, because now when you have a bug you have different sources and so on. So that's a solution that you can manage using a different target in your WinDev mobile project. That helps a little. You have a common core and then different target with different windows and different window size and so on, but still you have much more to manage. The other solution is to have one version that can adapt to each case. So the problem at that point is, how do you manage that? Are you just developing the smallest common denominator, only the smallest window, and then there are pros and cons for each method. We're going to look at that in much more detail. We are now going to have a look at what you should do when you are trying to design an application for one specific company. Of course, the first thing to do is to define what the application should do, and for that you're going to see the requirement list course that we had in WinDev. That part is the same, except that, of course, you have some specific mobile points. And by example, I'm going here to make a list of many of the mobile points that you have to define in your requirement list. You will need the definition in order to be able to choose what device to use and how to design your application. So the first thing is the type of connection needed. Do you need a device that will be connected all the time in-house using Wi-Fi, by example? This is, in my experience, one of the least often case, but it happens. And in that case, will you have a Wi-Fi coverage everywhere? How will you have that? So you will have to design at the same time that you design your mobile application. You will have at the same time to find out what hardware you're going to need to cover your whole factory, by example, and have the device that are used to manage the stock working all the time. And in an industrial environment it can be much more of a challenge than it is in an office. So all that is going to be part of your mobile development, even if it's some fixed hardware that is going to have to work with it. It can be also the connection that you will need in the outside world, and in that case it can be something like GPRS, Edge, 3G, and so on. What are these? Well, these are different kind of network that are available out there, and available not everywhere out there. The smallest connection are available in a much broader area. But of course, even those are not available everywhere. When you are outside of your network and roaming, most of the time you don't have data access. So all these considerations have to be taken into account at the design time. So what is available where? If your customers are going to use that only in one city, well, you have to see what kind of network is available in the city. Is the network available everywhere in the city, or do you have to choose another one that is available everywhere, and so on. Then there's something that we generally don't think about, is the required battery life. if the device is going to be used 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day and in connection all the time, you will need something with a battery that will support that. So the battery life is going to be different when the device is not connected to the network and when it's connected. There is much more power used when you are connected either via Wi-Fi or via GPRS than when you are just using passively the device. Another point that you have to consider is when you need a barcode reader. Do you need some barcode reader that is integrated in your device or an external one that is connected? Then what is the amount of main memory in the device? The example I gave you earlier is a 64 megabyte memory. That's generally the biggest that you're going to get, and it's going to create problem. If you try to run the full WinDev mobile set of DLL inside this 64 megabyte memory where you already have the system and several programs running, you're going to have an out of memory error. So knowing how much memory you're going to need, knowing where you're going to run your program are going to be things that you need at design time. Are you going to need an attached printer or not? That's also something that is going to be a big consideration. You're going to use that, by example, if you give mobile device to reps and they have to print order and leave them to their customer. That's something that you're going to consider too. Another thing that can be available in some device is an integrated GPS. Of course, there's also the possibility to connect the GPS to a mobile device, but some of them, like the one I'm using, has its own GPS inside. Of course, again, if you're using the GPS functionality, it uses more battery, more power than when you're not using it, which means that you have to take that into account in the required battery life. So, also another problem is the local database size. With SD card, you have a size that can be 1 gigabyte, 500 megabyte, 2 gig, 4 gig. This will, of course, influence the size, the price of the device, and you will need to have enough to store the information you need. If you're dealing a lot with images, you're going to need more space. So that is going to be something that you have to consider also. Then you have the maximum computing power needed. Remember that these devices are way less powerful than a PC. It means that when you have a 200 MHz processor or a 250 MHz processor, you're going to really feel the difference when you're working. So what are you going to do on the device? If it's just enter a few information every minute, you don't need that much power. Now, if you're going to do some heavy computing, you're going to use the GPS to get information, then map where you are and give the user automatically the best itinerary and do this and do that and so on, and do complex calculation based on grids. Well, you're going to need computing power to do all that. One extremely important point is the screen size. Obviously, people are going to work on that thing the whole day. If you have a very small screen, it means that either you will have very few information available at the same time on the screen, which can be a real pain, or that, well, people won't be able to read them easily. And remember also that these people are going to work sometime in places where the light is not that good. They are going to work in a factory. They are going to work in some places where they won't have a good visibility. So the screen size and its characteristics are extremely important. Of course, there's also the type of input device. If you set up your rep with smartphones with a phone keyboard in it, they are not going to be your friend for very long. They will have to enter information using this type 3 times on the touch on a key to have one letter. That's not good. So the type of input device is of course extremely important. If you have a phone keyboard, if you have a regular keyboard, or if you have a touch screen, you're going to make the life of your user easier or harder depending on your application. And sometimes the highest end device, the touch screen, is not as good as a regular keyboard. It depends on what you have. If you have lots of input where you just check boxes and click on things and all that, the touch screen is perhaps better. Now if you have lots of text to enter, is it easier to enter it using a regular keyboard or a touch screen? You can talk about that for quite some time and not agree, of course, but touch screen, you have more training for people to be able to do that fast. Regular keyboard is something else. And then you have also the specific needs where you have people in a harsh environment. They are working outside, so they have to work with gloves. There's no way you're going to use a regular keyboard or a touchscreen. So you're going to have to use a specific device with very, very big control, few of them, and let them work that way. So all that is extremely important. There are also other things that are available on devices like that, like a speakerphone. Obviously, if you're using a smartphone, there will be some communication at some point. If you're talking with a driver of a truck, you don't want the guy to have to take the smartphone and put it on his ear. You want to have a speakerphone in it, or any type of external device that can be used as a speakerphone. That's something that you have to consider too. Do you need a Bluetooth connection? Oh, yes, no, for a printer, for this, for that, for your network. Do you need that? Do you need a camera? Many of them now have built-in camera, and you can take picture and use the picture inside your application. Are you going to need that or not? That will be part of the choice of the device. There's also another feature that is available. It's the voice recorder. Are you going to need that or not? And so on. So as you can see, there are many things that you will have to define in the requirement list that you didn't have to define in a regular software development. And for this application that you are building for this specific company, once you know what the application should do, you should at the same time know what the device will need in terms of hardware characteristic. Clearly, some of these things are hard to quantify. How are you going to be sure that the required battery life will match the characteristic of the device you choose? You will find some information on the web, of course, on the manufacturer information. But if it's the same thing that it's for the laptop, what they're telling you, you have a 3-hour autonomy and you end up with 1 hour and 45 minutes when you really use the system, well, clearly some of these things are going to be a big problem. And also, very often when you're dealing with this kind of problem, some requirements that you have at the time of the design are not realistic for a mobile device. I was telling you about this customer who wanted to import a text file on the mobile device. Why not do that on the main network, come back with the text file and deal with it? I don't know. But suddenly you have a 55,000 record text file to import on a mobile device. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that it's going to take a lot of time because the device is not that fast. And is it realistic to have the user wait for its device to run for 1 hour and a half or 2 hours and a half or more while an import is being done. So some requirements are often not realistic because just, well, user once again do not realize what they're asking. So you can either change the requirement, explain that to the user, tell them you're going to have this problem, that problem, or another solution is to forget about WinDev Mobile and use WinDev instead on an ultra mobile PC, because the limit between a mobile device and a mobile device that is an ultra mobile PC is really not that big. The price of a high-end mobile device and of an ultra mobile PC is nearly the same. The ultra mobile PC generally has a much bigger screen. We are talking about 8 inches screen or something like that, and has characteristics that are much higher. It's more speed, it's a hard drive, it's this and that. Now, of course, once again, you are changing the problem. There will be other problem with this kind of device, but you will not have the same perhaps characteristic that you would have with a mobile device. Perhaps you won't have the GPS, perhaps you won't have this or that. So one way of dealing with all this kind of problem is to really check, is your application really for WinDev Mobile or is it for WinDev? You then have your requirement list with all your hardware specifications and all that. So now that you have all these requirements, you start to choose a device. That's the first thing that you do. At that point, you haven't coded one line. You don't care about coding. You have to choose a device. And of course, you verify that it will still be available when your application is done. It's true that in 1 year or 2 years or 18 months when your application is coded, or 3 months if it's a small application or whatever, the new devices that will be available will generally have higher characteristic. But sometimes they will have higher characteristic in one domain and not one that you needed in other one. An example for that is again the device that I chose, this HTC P3300. Well, it has only a touchscreen and it has a GPS. And if you look at the newest one that was proposed to me at the same time, it doesn't have GPS and it has touchscreen and keyboard. So is that acceptable for me? Well, if I don't need a GPS feature, yes. If I need a GPS feature, absolutely not. So you have to realize that the lifespan of this device are not that long. So basically, you better choose a device that just came out a few months ago and not 2 years ago. Otherwise, you will be in trouble and you will have to find something else that matches everything at the end, and that's sometimes very difficult. Then you buy one. You do not wait till the end of your development cycle to buy a device. You buy it immediately before you start coding anything. And you verify that it does really match all requirements. If you have a requirement that the battery time when connected to Wi-Fi is 10 hours, well, you take the device, you connect it to Wi-Fi, and you work on it really for 10 hours. You don't just let it stand here because you don't know if the power consumption is going to be the same. You really test it to see if it matches all your requirements. Because if it doesn't, you have to choose another one, and you have to find out why they were telling you that it would match the requirement. So it's extremely important at that point that you verify that everything is going to work on a hardware standpoint. Then you can start coding your application. And of course, because you have that device that is the final device, the one that you're going to use, during the whole coding cycle, you test on the device. You do not test in the emulator mode. Of course, you will test in emulator mode because it's a great tool for debugging your logic, but you don't stop at that. You test on the device. You're going to test your code by itself, the program, how it works, but you're also going to test the install. Do not let yourself use the functionality in WinDev mobile that is test on the device. When you are in WinDev mobile and you do a go, you have the choice between testing in emulator, testing on the device, or really installing on the device. Use test on emulator and then forget the other two. They are not there, in my opinion, as a good option. What you should do is create really the install that you're going to give to your users, and when you want to test on your device, you create a real install and you transfer the information, the installer, on the machine the same way that your user will do. You install and you test. This will let you test all the aspects of the application during the whole development cycle. Same thing for the update. Just don't do main install. You will send updates to your users. So create updates and install them the real way. If you plan on having your user do the install and the update via the web, do it that way from the beginning. This way you will see if it's too slow, if it's not usable, you will have to change something. Perhaps use patches instead of updates, and so on. So all that has to be a very polished process at the time when you're letting your user go out there with your device. Same thing for the data transmission. You want to put yourself as much in the same situation as you can. If you're going to use a device in a factory environment with very hard condition, you will have to tell your customer or your boss in your company, if it's an in-house application, that you will need to test from scratch with the real transmission in the real environment. If you spend 6 months or a year developing something and you end up at the end telling your boss that it won't work because now that I'm testing it in the factory, there's just too much problem in transmission and we cannot connect, they're not going to be happy with you. So you really have to push them and to be sure that you will be able to test from scratch in the environment that you're going to be using at the end. So everything that you do during this development cycle has to be tested on the device in real case scenario. Then when the application is ready, at the end, the application is ready. If you don't do all that, you will have a whole lot of time to add to the end of the development cycle to do just that, and people will not wait for you. And if you have a problem at that point, you will not be able to solve it. If you have a problem at the beginning, you can change something, find another device, find another way of transmitting things. But it's early enough in the development cycle that you didn't invest 3 or 4 year man development time in something that will not work. But remember also that the application is ready for that device and that device only. It has been tested for this one. That's why you have to buy this device at the end. And in that specific configuration, don't let yourself be tempted to buy the new version that just came out the week before. You didn't test on that one. Find the hardware that you tested on, buy it, buy the 50 or the 60 or the 3 or the whatever number you need, and deal with that. If you change anything on the hardware, you have a huge potential of being in trouble. The second case, of course, is when you want to create an application for the general public, for everybody. Of course, the general public here is much more small. It's much smaller than the general public in the web case. There are still way less people using application on their mobile device that they are using the web. But still, it's still a big world out there. So if you want to define an application for everybody out there, the first thing, of course, is to follow everything that's in the requirement list, how to build a requirement list course in the WinDev course. Basically, all these things are the same. Then you have to define the specific mobile points the exact same way that you would do for the application for one company. So the list of specific points that you have to define is the same. The problem is that you are now trying to deal with everybody. So there's a small difference there, and it's a very complex part, in fact. Either you're going to define some minimum requirement. You're going to say that, okay, my application will work only if I have a GPS. Okay, well, clearly if you're doing some kind of GPS related application, you need a GPS. So it's a set of minimum requirements that all the device that you will support will need to have. Of course, it also means that if you want to go to minimum requirement, you're going to have to minimize the functionality that you can develop on it. Otherwise, well, there will be very few devices that will match your minimum requirements. The second possibility is to define several sets of requirements. You can say that my application will work if I have at least this and that, or at least this and that. Perhaps it will work in a different mode. I will code it differently in that case. Perhaps if I don't have GPS, then I will just rely on the fact that the user will tell me, okay, we arrived at that address and I want to go at this one. And the GPS part will not work, but the map directions will work, and so on and so forth. So you can have several sets of requirements saying, if I have the GPS, then this is working. If I don't have the GPS, I accept it, but in that case, only this and that is working. So you can end up defining this way 5, 10 different sets of requirements, depending on the different situation that you will accept. Example of that, if the screen is bigger than this, then I will display information that way. Otherwise, I will go back to a degraded mode where I have only this information available. If you look at an application again like Skype on mobile, you will see that they have just removed many functionality that you have in Skype for the mobile. There's just no room for it. So clearly, it's something that you can have also for different set of requirements in one same application. Another thing that you can state in your requirement is if high-speed data transfer is available, then. If not, then. One example, well, if high-speed data transfer is available, then I access directly the main database on the server. If not, I access only my small replicated database that I have on my machine, and I wait till the high-speed data transfer is available to connect and do this or that. That's one example. You will have an application that will work in two different ways depending on what is available. Remember that you have to think about the else. Do you have a degraded mode? If you do not accept to work in a screen that is less than, or if there is no high-speed data transfer, you have to state that. You will have to tell the user this will not work on this device or that device. So thinking about how you could have your application work in a degraded mode is sometimes a very good way to go, because you can sell your application to more people. It will be useful too for them, but less so if they have all the hardware requirements. If now you include every case in one application, remember what we said, you can either create one application that works for everybody or a different application depending on the cases. Well, if you include every case in one application, you have to realize that it can become complex. Now you are trying to accommodate everybody in the same application. and it also can be hard to configure for the user. If you try to build this kind of application, you'd better building some kind of automatism that will detect what is available or not and automatically configure the thing for them. If they have to go through 10 pages of settings saying I don't have this, I have that, I want this, I don't want, people will not just do that. Perhaps you will have a few users who will be happy to have all this control available to them, but again, you're trying to access the general public, and the general public will not know how to do that. Now, if you have one application per case, per set of requirements, you will be in a situation that can become much harder to maintain. Now you have different applications and different sources, different cases. When you're doing one modification, how do you deal with that in all the cases? So it can be harder. And also remember that you can use the project configurations to define several targets. So WinDev Mobile is going to help you do that if you want to manage it that way. I don't have all done solution for you telling you you have to do it this way or that way. It really depends of the kind of requirements that you have, of the application that you're building, and if you need to go to several sets of requirements, or if you can have minimum requirement and so on. So you will have to figure it out by yourself. It's extremely important that you define that correctly, that you take the time at the beginning to be sure that that's the way to go for your case. Remember that this kind of thing, when you define an application for everybody and many hardware, is something that is going to cost a lot of money to design and to build. So you better do it the right way. So again, the development of an application for everybody is based on the requirement that you define in the previous step. And based on those requirements, you're going to choose several devices. Now you have to not select one, because one will never be able to test all cases. So you have to choose several devices. One that is the minimum accepted case. It's extremely important that you have one thing that is your lowest point, the common denominator. Everything that is not mandatory is not on the device. You just have the really minimum. You have to test that case. Then you should also find one that is a medium case, something that is not too powerful, not too with too many options, that match some of your requirements but not all of them. And at least one that is the best case scenario where you have everything available on it. So that's what you need to choose at the minimum. It's also a very good idea to take one that has everything, your best case scenario, but something that will show you things. Everything is working, but I don't have that. What are the consequences really when you don't have that on the hardware? In that specific case, you don't really care if they will still be available when the development is done. You are going generic, so you are testing cases where this work, that work, but not this or that. Even if they are not available for sale anymore when the application is ready, remember that in that case, most of the time you don't sell the hardware, you don't deal with it. You just tell people it's working on this hardware, that hardware, and so on. So people will always have this hardware that you tested on. You just don't care if they're still available at the end. And once again, you're going to need to buy all these devices. At the strict really minimum, you're going to need to buy the minimum case, the one that is the most problematic for your development. But it's not a good idea to try to build a generic application for a mobile if you don't have several hardware to test on it. And the more hardware you have to test on, the better when you're going generic. And then you start coding only when you have the hardware. Again, you're going to do for your hardware, you're going to test on the hardware during the whole coding cycle. And you're going to test not on one of them, but on every available device in every configuration that you have. So clearly this is a much more expensive proposition in money to buy the device, in time to test. And it can be an extremely expensive one if you want to have something that is really generic. It's a the kind of big project that can take lots of resources. Again, you're going to do the exact same thing than in the previous case, but on more devices. So you have to test your code by itself. You have to test the install. It's extremely important. If you have, by example, one device that has a 3G connection at 1.5 megabit per second, another one that just have GPRS and the speed is about 100 kilobyte per second. Well, will it be acceptable for this GPRS device to download a 35 megabyte application? Is it doable? And you're not going to lose the connection in the middle, all this kind of thing. You will have to test on all this and see what is going to work and what is just going to be a problem for your support. If you end up building something and the only thing that you get are angry support call because it's not working, because they cannot download, because this or that, perhaps you should rework your requirement list and say we are not supporting anything that doesn't have 3G. Perhaps that's the solution. Perhaps another solution is to build an application that is smaller or that can be downloaded by a different part. First you download a small app, and then this app is going to download blocks and install them. It's possible. You will have to see what you have to do. Same thing for the updates. You have to test on every available device. Will it work? And of course, data transmission too. So all the things that our application is doing has to be tested in all cases. And that's where you're going to test the degraded solution. If you don't have GPS, is the usability of your application the same? Can the user do what he has to do with it? If you don't test that in all cases, you're in trouble. Now, when the application is ready, remember that the application is really ready because you tested it, but it's ready only on these devices. You trying to go generic, but you are sure that it's working only on this specific few devices that you tested during the whole coding cycle, and only in those configurations. If your devices were under Windows Mobile 5 and you didn't test on Windows Mobile 6, you don't know if it's going to work the same way or not. You will have security configuration that will have changed. You will have the right to do this or not, and you didn't have that problem before. So all this are going to be different for each device. So at that point, if you really want to go generic, you need to test on many more devices, and you will have to adapt your software and to modify your software in order for your software to work on all these other devices. You don't need to do that during the whole development cycle. It would take forever. But once you are at the step where your application is supposed to be finished and it's working on an array of devices that match all your requirements, then you have to test for all these things out there and to, of course, buy them to do that, which means that it's going to cost a lot of money. These devices do not come cheap, that's for sure. And that's one of the reasons why building an application for everybody for mobile is a very costly proposition. Of course, you can always put it out there and pray, but is it going to be a good thing for your company image? I don't think so.
Clearly, when you develop a WinDev mobile application, size is a problem. The definition of the screen is not that important. Why? Well, because when you have a 2-inch screen, if you have 300 or 600 points in it, you still have only a 2-inch screen, which means that even if you display some text in it, well, you can have the text that is more rounded with less of a scale effect, but still the size, the physical size in inches of your text will be the same, and you will still need to read it with the same size. So definition is not that important, but still you should know what you're going to get. Basically 640 by 480 is going to be the maximum that you'll find most of the time. More often, much more often, it's going to be 320 by 240. The example that I gave you of the device I'm currently using, this HTC, which is quite a high-end device, is 320 by 240. So that's very common. You can of course have lots of very exotic things. Things like 240 by 260. 352 by 416, 480 by 320, 800 by 352, 800 by 400. And I'm not talking about little device, unknown brand and things like that. The iPhone is one of those. So as you can see, there's absolutely nothing that is standard in any of that. And well, you will get something that is generally around 320 by 240, and that's all you will get. And we are talking about a screen that is about 2 inches large. You can have 1.8, you can have 2.2 or things like that, but most of the time that's what you're going to have. And a 2-inch screen, you can put, it doesn't matter what resolution you will have, you will get the same amount of text information on both 640 or 320 width screen. Just because, well, yes, if you use a smaller font, you will be able to put more information, but nobody will be able to read it. So it's really the physical side of the display that is going to be a problem for you. On the contrary, if you are using lots of graphic, clearly the graphic will be displayed in a better way on a screen with a higher resolution, but only image will be crisper, will be more pretty to look at. If you're talking about displaying information, so text on the screen, the size of the screen is more important than the resolution. And orientation is a big problem. Why? Well, most of the time your device will be in portrait mode, which means that you will have 320 vertically and 240 horizontally. But sometime, less often, you will have something that is in landscape. So that's some example. Landscape is going to be really less often, rarely. But the main problem is that on many devices it can dynamically change. The device I'm using has a setup. You just go in the window and you say, okay, now I want it in portrait, and everything goes in portrait. So if you designed your window for 320 height and 240 width, and suddenly the user chooses to change, so your window doesn't fit the screen anymore. So you need to deal with that. Worse, on some devices, the orientation of the text of the windows change as soon as you turn your device. There's a sensor in it, and it changes dynamically, really on the fly. So you need to be able to manage that. So when you're building your screen, you have to build your screen for the minimum value available. So if you're dealing with a 320 by 240 screen, then you need to build your windows in 240 by 240. After that, you will use the anchoring system to allow your window to increase in size automatically and your field to increase in size accordingly, but your minimum size would be the minimum of the width and height. Same thing if you're in 640 by 480, you have to create your windows in 480 by 480. And after that you have to deal on the problem of where do you put information. So the physical screen size is really the problem. Basically your main problem is when the user can't read anything. And I must tell you that on this cell phone PDA that I'm using, if I don't have my reading glasses, I can't see a phone number. I can't read it. So I'm not wearing my eyeglasses when I'm driving, by example. So it means that if somebody is calling me when I'm driving, I cannot see who's calling. So it's really painful. And users are not going to be your friend if you give them this kind of software. If they have to deal with that 8 hours a day, it just won't fly. Remember also that the size of the screen on your simulator is not the size on the real device. Yes, the definition is the same, but on your device it's a 1.8 inches and screen, and on your real screen perhaps it's 3 inches. So suddenly it's twice as big as it will be in the real life. That's one of the reasons you cannot rely on the simulator to really test your software. And you need really, if you want to do something that works well for this kind of market, you need to deal with all these people who will want to have bigger font size. You have to code for it. And for that you have to have a very easy way to change the size of the font in every kind of display that you have. You can deal with that by using tabs, by example, to separate information in group instead of having everything on the same screen and trying to display it as small as humanly possible. You can use scrolling windows. I don't like that, but lots of applications are using this kind of thing. We'll see in the next slide what other solution you have to deal with that. But you have to think about all that, how you're going to deal with it. And remember, on a device where the real estate is so rare, do you really need the menu? On a Windows mobile device, typically you have not only the taskbar that is at the bottom of the screen in Windows, but you have a taskbar and a window bar. So do you need a menu bar? Do you need the menu? Do you need the taskbar? You have to ask yourself that, because you can design your application in order not to have them. Your window can cover up these two areas. But then if you do that, how do you let the user use the other function of your phone? I've seen application on my device where, well, the application is using the whole screen, and you can't find a way to get back to the other application. And I'm not talking about any small application written by nobody somewhere. I'm talking about TomTom, one of the leading GPS applications in the world. Well, when you run it on my device, you can't get back to the menu. If you can, I didn't find how. And you just have no way of getting out of this thing. It's extremely frustrating. So really, what do you need if you don't need the menu, if you don't need the taskbar? How do you let the user go back and do something else? Ergonomy is a problem on a mobile device when you have such little real estate on the screen and such clumsy way of inputting data. You will have many problems when you design an application. If you continue to think the same way that you're thinking for Windows, you're going to be in trouble. So let's review what kind of problem we have to deal with on the ergonomy level. The first thing, size is a problem. Remember the size of your screen. The second, the user can change from portrait to landscape at any moment. You don't know what they're going to do. The third, how do you exit? I've seen way too many applications where you can enter in it, but there is no way to exit. Either you have a close button that doesn't close the application stays in memory, and when you come back at the same place. Is that really what you want to do? Personally, I don't like that. When I click on close, I would like the application to really close, or at least to ask me what I want to do. Second, I've seen application where there is no close button, and again here I'm talking about TomTom, not a small application made by a guy alone in his garage. It's a big international application made by one of the leading company in that domain. Well, when you start TomTom on my device, there is no close button. If there is one, it's so well hidden that I was not able to find it, and I'm not the only one. So how do you exit? Do you really want to have one close button taking real estate all the time? Visibly they didn't, but they didn't find any solution to exit also. How do you manage functions? Obviously the user will need to access functionalities all the time. How do you manage that? If you have a menu, it's taking real estate all the time. If you don't and you put buttons, it's taking real estate all the time. And again, you don't have real estate to do this kind of thing. So the menu use real estate. Right click could be a solution, except that it's absolutely not practical or not known or not available. On my device, on this HTC with a touchscreen, the right click is in fact when you put your stylus down and let it down without moving. That's the right click. You have to know it. You have to read the documentation to find out. On other devices like smartphone, there is just no right click available. So right click is something that you have to forget. It's just not possible. After that, remember that you will have only the model node. There is no way on this kind of device that you're going to have many little windows opening on this one side, the other, and so on. So it's only one window at a time. Really, only one window should be visible at a time. If you start to try to play with several windows on a WinDev mobile environment, you're really out of luck, because nobody was going to be able to use that. It's just no room for that. Remember also that from the window that is currently open, everything should be accessible. I've seen again too many applications that are written in an extremely rigid and linear kind of way. So you have to go through that step, then this one, then this one, then this one to access this thing. And if you want to just do the last one, you have to go through all the things that are before, even if you don't need them. So that's extremely painful. That's the kind of application that you use when you don't have a choice. If you have a choice, you go to something else. Because of all those constraints, there are very few options. Clearly, you don't have a lot of choice on what you can do. There are still a few that you can do, but it's clearly not easy. Very often you see software that is really impractical. You have to go through all the steps that the guy thought was the right way of doing things, and if you want to do it another way, you can't. So, what can you do? Let's review a few of the possibilities that you have and see the pros and the cons, and we're going to talk about the solution that I personally like for this kind of problem. The first thing that you have to do clearly is to keep the clutter hidden. You don't want to have 20 buttons on a very small screen, that's for sure. So there's no way you're going to make a a software with many things displayed at the same time on the screen. But at the same time, you want to keep things simple as possible, even simpler than it was on the web, because you have less room to deal with. It's a very good idea to group logical tasks, put together the things that the user is going to do together, and leave them as accessible as possible. This way you won't have to go through 5 different things to do something. Don't go through steps like that all over the place. Try to group information. When you have a contact form and you have one phone number, then one email, then one this, one that, and then suddenly 3 pages later you have the cell phone number, well, don't you think that it would be a best way to put together the home phone number and cell phone number and work phone number, so when you want to phone to somebody you can find all the information at the right place? Yes, there are applications like that on these devices, and it doesn't mean that you have to display things only one way. You can use tabs, have one way of grouping information on one type, the same information available on another one, grouped differently for another logical task. My opinion is that you should avoid scrolling as much as you can. Yes, there is very little real estate, so probably you will have to scroll at some point, but it's extremely not practical to have to scroll all the time through information to see one field, then go up to see another one, then down to see a third one, then up to see. It's really not practical, so try to avoid scrolling as much as you can. A very good thing to do is to use planes or tabs. It's basically the same thing, only in tabs you already have the buttons set up and the real estate taken by the buttons. So perhaps you can avoid using the real estate by using planes. This way you can group information, group tasks, and help the user deal with all that as easily as possible. One thing that I like to do in this kind of environment is to use one small icon as a menu starting point. How does that work? Well, you create a small icon, a 16 by 16 icon by example, which is your menu. And when you click on it, you have the menu coming up. So there's no need for a right click. It only takes a 16 by 16 icon. You can have the same one on each and every screen, and all the functions of that screen are in that small icon. So you don't need buttons, you don't need basically you don't need anything else than information and that small button on the screen. And you can have the close, go to Windows or anything else inside that menu, of course. So what you do is to display a contextual menu when you click on that icon. And this contextual menu can now use the whole window. You don't care about that. In fact, it can display another window that contains the menu. And you include everything in that menu, including cancel, save, main menu, and you can have a tree of menus the same way that you would have in a normal application, except they are all managed in that system. In the main menu, you're going to also want to include a continue option with a submenu if necessary for all the things that can be continued. Let's see how that would work. Let's say that you're dealing with an application where the user can enter a company, contacts, project, orders, things like that on his laptop. We are dealing with a rep and is entering this kind of information. And he is in the middle of entering a project, and he wants to suddenly he has a call from another customer, and he wants to go to that customer form. So clicks on the small icon, has the menu, go to main menu. Okay, click on go to main menu. In the main menu, go to customers. Okay, customers, has the customer, find customer, enter the name of the customer, the ID, whatever, has the customer form, and work on it. When it's done, close that, main menu, continue, project XYZ that you were entering before. And it didn't have to do anything, save, things like that. It's saved automatically in the sandbox because it's not finished. It's automatically entered in the things that were not finished, so he can continue that at any point that he wants. And he just do continue project XYZ, the form reopen, and he can from there just work on what he was doing. That's extremely practical. It's something that users love, and you can do that without that many problems. The only thing that you have to do is stop thinking in hierarchy of windows. Think that all the windows are the same level. You just have one menu window that is hidden most of the time that will display this menu or that menu or this menu or that menu depending on the context. And you're opening the window that is necessary at any given time. When the user requests to open another window, the first one closes. The content of the first one is saved in the sandbox if anything was changed, and entered in the list of things to continue. And that's it. It's a system that is not very complex to design, but is extremely powerful, and really users love that. This system really allows a huge flexibility. You can do whatever you want. You can go back, go forth, and deal with many information at the same time. And in current life, that's something that is really powerful. Of course, remember that you can use CLParam to save information automatically in sandboxes. That's one way of doing that. Another way of doing that is to use halias to declare a second version of a same file, or even as many as you have sandboxes, and save that in separate files. I personally prefer to do that in CLParam because I have everything in the same place, but that's just me. In the exact same way, the list of things that are available as sandboxes would be, in that case, in sandboxes record in CLParam. So it's something that can be done quite easily. Also, if you want to implement something like that, please don't use stacks of model windows that you have to close one after the other. Use instead one window that is open at a time. If you need to go deeper and open one window from another one, use sister windows. Each window as independent of the other as you can. Just send a parameter saying to the form, by example, open that, which this way this form will be able to be opened from anywhere with the same information, and you won't need to have the table of the contact open in order for the form of the contact to be open. So use sister windows, and do not keep all the windows open at a time. You should have at maximum one window open for the current work of the user, and perhaps the menu window that contains all the menu information. And everything else you close and you open when needed. Why do you want to do that? Well, remember, 64 megabytes of memory on your device is the maximum you'll get. You do not want your program to have 30 or 40 windows open, even if only one is visible at a time. So deal with that from the beginning. Do something that's clean at that level. Use as minimum memory as possible, and you will keep your user happy. Of course, now that you know what not to do, what to do, and how to do it, you still have the problem of test and debug, and that can be challenging. So the first thing that you have as debug, of course you have the debugger available, but this debugger will work in simulator mode. In that case, it's going to be fast. It's going to be fast like WinDev is fast, because basically you're still in WinDev. Of course, it's also going to be false. Your simulator has a bigger screen. It has a processor that is your PC processor, which is much faster than the processor on the device. The database is faster also. It's on your PC again, and all this makes this testing in the simulator very good for the logic of your application. If you want to debug if all the screens are opening the right way, if you can go through your menus and do what you have to do, all this kind of thing, testing in simulator makes perfect sense. Logic and workflow are really the thing that you will test in the simulator first and foremost. But of course, everything that is linked to the hardware will not be a good fit for this thing. So the second option that you have in WinDev Mobile is to test and debug on the Pocket by itself, on the device by itself. But now you have a problem. Automatic install for debug on Pocket is sketchy. As I told you, in the Go menu you have the choice to automatically test on the device. And for that, WebDev is trying to automatically install everything that is needed on the device. The main problem that there is with that is that it tries to install everything in the main memory, and you only have 64 megabyte memory. Most of the time what you want to do is to install everything on the SIM card and run it from there where you have more room. But you can't do that currently in WinDev Mobile. So when it tries to install everything in the main memory, you get a message saying there's not enough memory space, and the debug just doesn't work. So clearly having a debug option that doesn't work doesn't help you at all to debug. Now, trace that you were used to before in WinDev and WebDev just doesn't work, period. Even if it did, there is not enough real estate on the device to display a second yellow window with a trace in it. That just wouldn't be practical. So trace doesn't work when you're on the device. So, what can you do to test and debug correctly your WinDev mobile application? Well, the first thing is to test in the simulator. Even if it's false, even if it's too fast, even if this and that, that's the first step. If your application doesn't work in the simulator, there's absolutely no point in trying to test it on the device. So first test in the simulator, debug the logic of your application, debug the workflow, and then always test for real. And when I say test for real, it means really create an install, a full install. Do really the install on your device the same way that your user will do the install. Forget the automated go run the project test. Most of the time this doesn't work because there's not enough memory, or it tries to do it one way and you will not do it that way in the real world. When you do a real install, you set it up the way you want. You want to have it on SD card, you want to have it using MSI application, you want to have it using just a cab that you download. Whatever you choose, you do it that exact way, and you let yourself be the first tester of all the install problem that your user will have afterwards. You will know how to deal with that. It's really the real way your customer will work. So it's not a waste of time to do that regularly during the process. If you don't, you end up at some point with something that won't work on your customer devices because you haven't tested it. And that's not something that you want to have in the mobile world any more than in Windows. And also, there's a very good news. Use CLlog to track bugs on the device, because CLlog once again is working. I told you at the beginning in WinDev that CLlog was designed to help you debug in all the tricky situation. Well, it works in WinDev, it works in WinDev, WebDev, it works on the browser code in WebDev, it works with Ajax, it works in WinDev Mobile. This system of log works all the time. So just use it, and if you are connected to your network, you can log directly on the PC, so you can see it on the PC while using your device, which is very neat. You just create a small software in WinDev that read the text file every second and get the last information written in it, and you work on your device, your smartphone, your pocket PC. You do what you have to do, and at the same time on the screen of your PC you see the whole log and see what's going on. So it's very neat. If you're not connected, then you just log things on the SD card and you review it afterwards, or you even change from one application to the other on your mobile device, because here too you can have a small application that regularly read the file and display it in a window, and in your regular application you have go back to Windows, and on Windows you have this other application. So you can even debug with your device as a standalone application using CLlog. Please, whatever you choose to do, try to stay away from the cool feature. Cool feature, what it is? Well, let's say that, well, cool feature is taking a picture and automatically incorporating in your database, sending it via email to the main database, and on the device directly rotate the image, crop part of it, and so on and so forth. Oh yeah, it's cool. You have so much power there, except that you're running on a 200 MHz processor, that the picture that you took is something that is 3 MB file that when unzipped use 25 MB of memory, and you just don't have the memory to deal with that on the device. And then how do you automatically take a picture? Well, it works on that device but not on this one, because now you need a specific DLL that works only on specific hardware, and so on. So yes, there are extremely cool feature that you can implement in your WinDev mobile application, but as much as you can, stay away from them. It's okay to let the user do a little work on its own. Perhaps it can just take the picture with the device, and once the picture is in the directory, well, you can use it and put it in the database, or just put a link to it. That would be even easier. But don't try to do everything automatically. Sometimes you won't be able to. Yeah, remember, these things are not standard, which means that each hardware is going to be some specific DLL that will not be compatible with one or the other. So you will have to code now for one specific hardware and manage all that added to everything else. We are nearly at the end of this course, and at this slide I would like to review a few things that we saw at different places and put them together to try to give you a final image of WinDev Mobile and what you will have to deal with when you start using that environment. WinDev Mobile is probably one of the best environments for mobile development out there. I'm not going to say that it's the best one, because clearly I haven't tried all of them, but I really believe that it's one of the best one. And one of the reasons for that is its close link with WinDev and WebDev, which means that you can very easily exchange information, connect, and so on. All the code that you have in WinDev per se to connect to the WinDev mobile environment is extremely great too, all the C function and so on. So it's one of the most comprehensive environments for mobile development, in my opinion. But it's still young. Remember, it's the baby in the PCSoft family of products. And because it's still young, there are bugs, there are quirks, and there are problems. Not all of them are coming from WinDev Mobile. Windows Mobile is also extremely young compared to Windows, so you will have your share of problem coming from Windows Mobile. The hardware by itself is also extremely not mature compared to a PC hardware. So all that contribute to give you much more problems that you would have in a Windows environment. WinDev is working on Windows Mobile. That is not the most stable operating system out there, obviously. We are all already complaining about Windows in itself. So imagine when they try to downsize that thing to put it on a mobile device. It's just a few megabytes of memory. Well, obviously that was probably not very easy. So we will have some problem because of the OS. And remember also that WinDev mobile program are going to work on mobile devices, and this kind of hardware is not the fastest hardware that you will find out there, and it's not the most stable hardware that you'll find out there. Anybody who used a cell phone know that losing connection is normal, that this not working, that not working is something that happens all the time. Well, you have to deal with that when you're in the WinDev mobile environment. Also remember that it's a very different kind of hardware. Now you are dealing with specific functions, specific peripherals, lots of things that are just not standard. So all this makes for a kind of development that is more strenuous than you will have in your regular WinDev development. You have to be aware of that. You have to know that before you start any project in that environment. And again, the same way that I was telling you in WebDev that you need to have a web development philosophy, for mobile you will need to think mobile, have a really mobile philosophy. Again, think light, think practical, think of all those people are going to use your software out there in the middle of nowhere, and will be in big trouble if something doesn't work. So you really have to be extremely strict on how you do things. Thank you.